Hey, all you literary legends and luminaries. Today's Halloween episode of Booksmart is appropriately a creepy book. It's The Trial of Lizzie Borden, A True Story by Kara Robertson. If you haven't heard of Lizzie Borden, well, she's been around for quite some time. 1892 was when it happened, it being the little playground limerick you might have heard before. Lizzie Borden had an axe. She gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. That sums up what happens, although it's not quite factually correct. I've known the story of Lizzie Borden for years. I remember when I watched A Nightmare on Elm Street, the original 1984 one. My sister, who was older than me by 4 years, wanted to watch it. I saw it just before I entered 6th grade. Probably not the best idea because I had nightmares for weeks. My mom was against it, but my dad didn't care. I remember my mom saying to my dad, "You're staying up with them if they have nightmares." Of course, my dad didn't. In any case, I remember first hearing of Lizzie Borden when my sister and I were singing the 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you, 3, 4, better lock your door. I didn't understand why playground songs were so awful and deadly, like the Ring Around the Rosie one. That's when my dad told us the Lizzie Borden one. From an early age, I loved true stories. But before the internet, I didn't know much about Lizzie Borden and her axe. I remember watching a TV movie about her that starred Elizabeth Montgomery, Samantha from Bewitched, when I was probably in junior high. And then decades later, there was the fictionalized TV series on Lifetime, and then the movie Lizzie with Kristen Stewart. And then we almost visited Lizzie Borden's house in Fall River, Massachusetts, but that was at the end of our trip after we had gone to the 9/11 Museum, Salem, Massachusetts, and Emily Dickinson's house. I guess by then we had had enough of death and were too tired and ready to go home back to the Midwest. So we didn't visit Lizzie Borden's house. The Lizzie Borden murders go like this. Her stepmother dies first, upstairs, with at least 20 axe wounds. About 90 minutes later, her father is whacked on the couch about 10 times. Lizzie and the maid were the only two home at the time, and so the mystery began. It probably wouldn't have been such a mystery if it happened in more recent times. You clearly only have two possible suspects, yet this great mystery surrounds Lizzie Borden. I wonder if such great mystery will surround O.J. Simpson in 100 years. Maybe we're fascinated by such cases because the guilty party is found innocent. Based on this book, it sounds like Lizzie Borden's trial was the O.J. Simpson trial of her century. I must admit at first, I was bored with the book. That's not completely Robertson's fault. I knew the story well, even the minor details, like how Lizzie said she was eating a pear in the yard and or looking for fish wire in the barn, and about the bloody clothes in the cellar that were supposedly due to her period. And I still couldn't make sense of the confusing layout of the house and all the locked doors. The way Robertson wrote about the crime was less than stellar, though. I almost didn't keep reading it, thinking I had wasted my money and now my time on something I already knew everything there was to know about. But after about 50 pages, the book switches to the legal side of things, the lawyers, the court documents, and such. And it was fascinating. Sometimes I wonder how anything functions in our society. At the heart of the trial was the fact that Lizzie Borden was a woman and of good social standing and economic standing. That in and of itself altered how both the prosecution and the defense prepared and presented their cases. The belief at the time was that a woman could not have committed such a gruesome, brutal crime in such a manner with a hatchet. Yet this surprises me since pioneer women did a ton of hard work and labor, although maybe city folk didn't think about such a comparison. Women couldn't serve on juries in 1892, so every single person of power in that courtroom was male. And men squirm when we talk about periods. It's almost laughable. So much so that it removes some of the creepiness and the gruesomeness and the horror of what actually happened. Two people were bludgeoned to death in their homes in the middle of the day, and the prime suspect is the daughter. And this happened to a prominent, well-behaved, important family in the community. Yet these grown professional men, not prepubescent boys, are uncomfortable discussing a woman's period. These are lawyers and doctors and scientists and judges, yet no one wants to discuss Lizzie's monthly illness as it is referred to. I can't summarize this for you, so let me read to you what Robertson writes regarding her findings. So they're talking about her monthly illness, and the lawyer says, "We do not care to go into the details. It is also agreed that the sickness ended Wednesday night." Robinson was content to let that fact explain the bloody towel soaking in the cellar toilet pail, as well as the spot of blood on Lizzie's inner skirt, and to move quickly on. But the prosecution's reluctance to explore the issue was surprising. Menstruation, according to medical experts, made women vulnerable to criminal impulses. When Daugherty began to describe the pail of bloody towels found during his search of the cellar, Moody curtly interrupted, "Pass from those." Even Borden's suspicious nocturnal visit to the cellar the night after the murders, recounted by Officer Hyde earlier that day, was largely assumed to be related to her monthly illness. Despite the potential significance of the evidence, the men all let the matter drop. They averted their gaze from the contents of the pail as if it would require staring into the abyss. So we're ignoring something that might be critical to guilt or innocence and facts. PMS can make you murder someone. I mean, that's what they're saying. Even Nellie Olson wouldn't kill someone while she had her period. She might contemplate it, but she wouldn't carry it out. I don't know what's worse, the science of the time calling menstruation a monthly illness, or no one wanting to bring it up in court. If you truly believe that a period could explain the unexplainable murders and provide a motive, why wouldn't you hammer that idea into the jury? Pun quite intended. The defense wanted to argue that Lizzie would have been covered in blood due to the axe murders, but the prosecution didn't want to bring it up as a possible theory to explain the lack of a bloody dress. That is, that Lizzie could have done the murders nude, but that would have been too scandalous. It's crazy. Yet the doctor brings in the skulls of both Andrew and Abby Borden, and no one thinks that's gruesome, not to mention the bodies were buried without the heads. But nudity and periods are not to be spoken of. I don't know why I'm surprised, considering how society acts today and yesterday and 100 years ago. Robertson also develops the issue of Bridget Sullivan, the immigrant servant of the Borden household, and how if Bridget would have been the only one in the house at the time of the murders, she would not have been treated as kindly as Lizzie, simply because she's an immigrant maid of a lower social class. The prosecution said during closing statements, "Is there one law for Bridget and another for Lizzie? God forbid." This is a fascinating statement, considering how people of color or any disenfranchised group were treated prior to the turn of the century, or even after the turn of the century, or even just a few years ago, or now. But that's way outside the scope of this trial, I think. What Robertson does well, she has thoroughly researched every printed document regarding Lizzie Borden. She describes the fighting newspapers to sell the most papers and the outright lies that they published. I don't think she left anything unturned. I appreciate all of that information because Robertson did all the work, and now I just get the pleasure of reading her findings. From the eccentricities of the lawyers and the outright boredom of the jurors, and Lizzie reading Charles Dickens while in jail. I love such details. It's also sad to see that our legal system hasn't changed all that much, at least the way this trial was presented. The same hijinks most trials have. They argued over Lizzie's inquest testimony, and it was not to be heard by the jury. Blood spatter testimony, a point of contention, questionable witness testimonies. Some things never change, but those findings, when quoted at length, can be a bit boring. Court cases are surprisingly boring and slow-paced unless you have Charles Manson acting out in the courtroom or O.J. Simpson making silly faces while trying on gloves. Otherwise, no matter how sensational or gruesome or tragic the crime, trials are essentially boring. Robertson could have trimmed some of the quotes to move the story along at a more narrative pace. And another problem, it's rather repetitive. The prussic acid, the periods, the dress or lack thereof, whether you could see Abby's body as you walked down the stairs, all these and much more are brought up several times without any conclusion. I couldn't help but see the trial and just the trial part play out like a miniseries. I don't remember the most recent movie Lizzie going into detail about some of the trivial court matters. The point of view is usually focused on Lizzie, not the jury or the lawyers, which was information I appreciated because this book was not from Lizzie's point of view. It didn't fictionalize a potential relationship between Bridget and Lizzie, which was not a part of any court's theory, but a potential incestuous relationship between Lizzie and her father was. It was brought up by Lizzie's defense lawyer, if only to defuse the prosecution's attempt to show the conflict in the household, which was ironically okay to bring up, but not her period. Here's how Robertson wrote about this relationship. In theory, he presented the jury with a sentimental fantasy, diffusing the tension in the Borden household and creating a portrait of idealized love and harmony particularly attracted to jurors who were fathers themselves. But his suppression of any discord between father and daughter and his decision to depict their relationship as a union, symbolized by a ring, a pledge of plighted faith and love, was unsettling. In his zeal to demonstrate Andrew's undying love, he inflated the significance of the ring, reshuffling the roles of father and daughter into those of husband and wife. Insisting on Lizzie and Andrew's intense attachment raised the possibility that this was, at its heart, a crime of passion. If so, then periodic insanity, a form of female temporary insanity in which otherwise respectable women killed husbands or lovers, might provide a way of making sense of the otherwise inexplicable crimes. And, as he pointed out, Lizzie was in the throes of her monthly illness, a fact he used to explain the bloody towels in the cellar, the tiny spot on the inside of her skirt, her inconsistent stories, her visit to the cellar the night after the murders, and even her premonitions of doom when she visited Alice Russell. He said, "You will recollect that Miss Lizzie's monthly illness was continuing at that time, and we know from sad experience that there is many a woman at such a time as that is all unbalanced, her disposition disturbed, her mind disabled for a period of time." His choice of language, unbalanced, disturbed, disabled, was uncomfortably close to the medical criminological discussions characterizing menstruation at a time in which an otherwise sane woman might be tragically susceptible to an insane impulse. I can't even make any sense of that whatsoever. Civilization would have never survived if periods were in fact a motive or explanation for death and destruction. So does Robertson's book break open the case of Lizzie Borden? No. If you're hoping to find the smoking gun, or more appropriately, the bloody hatchet, which may or may not have certifiably been found, you will be disappointed with the book. However, there are tidbits that I didn't know before, focus more on the historical times and how courts ruled and lawyers worked and juries sat for hours in un-air-conditioned boredom, how women were treated, how we treated monthly illness, how class played a part, and how all these things screw up the facts and the evidence and get us further from any sort of semblance of truth and the guilt or innocence at hand. I don't think it's much of a mystery at all. If Lizzie Borden didn't kill her stepmother and father, who did? In my opinion, Lizzie Borden got away with murder. She wasn't the first, and we know she wasn't the last. Maybe her motive isn't a big secret. Lizzie wanted the money and property, or maybe there is a big secret. I'm just imagining how history would have changed and how our present would be different had Lizzie been found guilty by reason of her monthly illness. That's all for this episode. My goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.